So, Luis, I would love to start this episode with you today by, well, first skipping the introduction. I don't think we need to do an introduction here for my listeners, for anyone who's had, you know, any formal education in sports nutrition, read a sports nutrition textbook, they're going to be familiar with you and your work, even if they've just, looked into a couple of articles on PubMed about general guidelines for sports nutrition when it comes to optimizing nutrition around the event, before, during, and after, whatever it may be. They've definitely come across your work as Burke being the lead author on a paper. So we'll skip the formal introduction, and I want to hop right into your work at the Olympics most recently, which is super exciting. So could we begin here by providing an overview of your role at the Olympics and the specific athletes you were working with?
Yes, so look, I've had a wonderful career. In an earlier part of it, I was the headquarters or chief dietitian for the Australian Olympic team. That started back in '96, being the first dietitian. And then by the time that I sort of retired from active duty after London, there were quite a few dietitians on the team, either attached to headquarters or travelling with the sports themselves. So having retired and then moving into other phases of my life, I got a chance to go to Sapporo to assist with the marathon runners and the race walking events as part of the Australian team. And that came about because the event, which was originally hosted in Tokyo, was changed to Sapporo when there was some considerations around the health issues of getting those very high intensity but prolonged endurance events in the weather that was expected. So when the move to Sapporo was announced, it suddenly meant that the Australian team had to split itself into two, because the events in Sapporo were going to run at the same time as the other track and field events in Tokyo. And so I was asked to come in to assist, so that the athletics team already had a sports dietitian, Jess Rothwell, as both manager and providing nutrition services. But we felt that there was going to be more work needed on the ground. And so I was lucky enough to come in and host Jess. And it was a terrific experience because, she's a young up-and-coming sports dietitian doing really great work. But, she was really appreciative, and she kept saying to me, "Oh, it's so wonderful. We've got, people who have done the research, developed the practices, and now actually being able to have hands on the ground in this situation." So it was, for me, a really specific involvement with the Olympics. I didn't have to do all the enormous preparation and work that went into the main headquarters team like I had done in previous times. So I was able to go and work with the marathon runners and race walkers. And I think the reason I was asked to do this is I've had quite a bit to do with our Australian race walking team, but also internationally. The supernova studies had made us really good friends and colleagues with so many of the other teams and their race walkers. So it was a great chance to see some of my other favourite athletes, as well as help the Australian team.
And you mentioned the supernova studies there, and of course, we'll likely get back to those in our conversation. For the listeners who might not be too familiar with the differences, you mentioned there that we had competitive race walking as well as the marathon runners. I know I really enjoyed watching competitive race walking. It's quite a sight to see how fast these athletes are moving, and the limitations of only being able to walk. I think you have to keep both heels can never leave the ground at the same time. Is that the rule?
And yes, and a straight knee. So it's funny because I'm a newcomer to race walking. Relatively, I started working with Jared Talent, Australia's best male race walker, and in fact probably the world's best race walker, who retired just before Tokyo, but he and I worked on his Olympic campaign for London, and so I got to hang out with the race walkers then. And prior to that, if you'd asked me, I'd have said, "Oh, it's a silly event." In fact, the joke was mentioned at one of the Olympic broadcasts in previous years that it's a silly event because it's just like trying to tell someone to whisper the loudest, see who can whisper the loudest. And so I'd already had that in the back of my mind. But when you work with these athletes, it's an incredible sport for a number of different reasons. One is, as you said, I mean, they're working at phenomenal speeds. And for me, I can run at the same speed that they're doing some of their easier sessions with, all their 50K race speed. I can't keep up with them when they're doing their sort of 10K, 20K speeds. But it allowed me to go out and do a lot of training with these people, and you get to know people. And it's often when you see people in your office as a practitioner, you have one sort of relationship. But when you're out then in their office, if you like, and you're out on training events, and sometimes I'd be out with Jared for 4 hours with the training sessions that he would do to get ready for the 50K event. And so you start appreciating them and understanding different things around their sport. And so because of that involvement, I started to think about how good it was as a nutrition exemplar, because the 50K event is sort of a 3.5 hour event for the males, 4 hours for the females. And so it does get into this nutrition territory where you have to be so careful about fueling and hydration, and there's plenty of opportunity for other nutrition strategies to have a place. But the beautiful thing about it is that it's done on a looped course, so that the race walkers are always in contact with the judge to make sure that they're using correct technique. So that means that if it's a 2K loop or a 1K loop, that they're coming past a fixed place very regularly. So you can provide a lot of nutrition support, and it's more frequent than a marathon, but it's the same feed station. So if you're trying to work with the athlete to run a nutrition program, you can keep contact with them the whole of the race, and you can keep adjusting that nutrition program based on feedback from the athlete. So it's different to a marathon race where you sort of go past an aid station and that's just one experience, and they go off to another aid station, and it would be very difficult to connect up all the dots on those aid stations. So I suddenly thought, what a great sport in terms of providing a nutrition challenge, but giving you particularly good opportunities to address it in real time. And that's when I started really getting involved in race walking and starting to think about what could we do to help these guys go faster and longer.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and such a critical difference between the two. Before we dive further into specific nutrition strategies for these competitions, I think for those who might be unfamiliar with these events, you alluded to that there is a 50 km race for the competitive race walkers. And then is the other one, is it a 20?
Yeah, so that was the last time that the 50K event will be on the Olympic program. It's going to move now to a 35K walk, which is a little bit disappointing. But the 50K event has been on the program. I think race walking was 1932 was first added to the Olympic program. And of course, there's world championships and world cups in intervening years that are the way to show who's the best in the world. And these guys move. So the 50K world record had the lead competitor going through the marathon at 42K in just under 3 hours. And so it's pretty good to be able to run a sub-3 marathon, but think about walking it. That's moving.
Yeah, absolutely. And then how does that compare to the distance for the events for the competitive marathoners, and then their world record times in comparison to the race walkers?
Yes, so the world record in marathon is just over 2 hours, and there's been that unofficial successful attempt to actually break the 2-hour barrier. So these people are moving at really fast speeds. And I've been to a number of, I love doing marathons myself, and often when I go to a race, there's a shoe company that often turns up to promote the race, and this is the marathon, and what it has is a truck with a treadmill on the back of it, and it has the treadmill running at the speed that the athletes are doing. So they're running around 3-minute Ks, and it invites the people in the audience, if you like, to get up on the treadmill in the harness and see how long they can maintain that marathon pace. And most of them after 30 seconds have been spat out the back, because people just don't realise, because particularly the best marathoners in the world, those beautiful running styles of the East African runners, they make it look like they're hardly expending any effort at all. And so when you try and do it yourself, you realise that the marathon is not a fat burning event, if you like. There's so often we think about aerobic exercise as being in the fat burning zones, but these guys are really moving, and they're moving at the highest possible utilisation of fuel that you can do.
It's beautiful to watch. I mean, I remember as I was watching one of the marathons during the Olympics, you had the top three who were just so efficient, and they're moving so quickly and looked like they were barely expending any effort, and then literally just going back to like 6th, 7th place, and just like the stride length, the effort you see from the athletes, it's a completely different ball game, and these are the best runners in the world, but you can even see that difference within that upper echelon. It's fascinating.
And one of the things you just said then is the economy, or the efficiency of movement. That's one of the key attributes of really top distance, both race walkers and marathon runners. You need to have a high VO2 max. You need to be able to run at a high percentage of that and sustain that. But you also need to be really economical, so that for whatever speed you're running, you're burning the least amount of oxygen possible. And that's the key, because there's a limit to how high your VO2 max can be, and there's a limit to how much of it you can use before you start losing metabolic control and producing a lot of lactic acid and byproducts. And so what you want to be able to be is so efficient that you're using the least amount of energy to keep that speed up. And that's one of the reasons that we got interested in looking at the fueling of the race. Is there a better fuel for being efficient than others?
For the listeners who, it might have been a couple of years since they looked at some of your reviews on the topic, I think it would be nice just to briefly touch on some of the basic guidelines when it comes to sports nutrition for endurance athletes, at least before we get into the weeds with some of the most recent controversy within this area. But when it comes to the before event and during event nutrition strategies for the competitive race walkers and the marathon runners, what are some of the general guidelines that we're looking for here? And then maybe we can go into the specific differences, if there are any, and just individualizing the process for the athletes. So I guess let's start with before, and we'll start with maybe a few days out. So if the athletes partook in any carbohydrate loading, and then maybe touching on some guidelines for a pre-race meal for the athletes.
Sure. So if we're just thinking about the fueling, then you're wanting to make sure that you have the supplies that are readily available to the muscle, and that's either within the muscle storage or coming from the bloodstream that can be topped up during the race. And when we're dealing with races of this sort of duration and intensity, we really start thinking about fat and carbohydrate being the two major fuel sources. There are other pathways that we produce energy for exercise, but when it comes to those longer events at these sustained high intensities, it's really coming down to carbohydrate and fat. And so what we know is that fat's stored both within the muscle and also in our bodies, and then can be delivered from the fat deposits in our bodies to the muscle in very large amounts. Even when you look at those very, very lean distance runners and distance race walkers, and you can think, oh, wow, they're hardly carrying anything. There's still enough body fat on that to be able to have them being able to exercise at a certain intensity for days, even a week. So you've sort of you're carrying on your body some fuel stores that could be used for a very long period without running out. And the carbohydrate stores have got a finite length. So we store some carbohydrate in our muscles as glycogen, and then we have some coming in from blood glucose that can be taken up by the muscle. And we've got the ability in longer events to be able to keep topping up blood glucose by drinking or eating carbohydrate during the event, and that can become an increasingly more important supply of carbohydrate, because the muscle stores, even when you maximise them, elite athletes are very good at doing that because their training helps their muscle to be good at storing glycogen. But even under the best circumstances, they're probably going to run out at about 90 to probably 150 minutes of exercise, depending on the event and the intensity that you're going at. So that's why we talk about hitting walls in races, or bonking, depending on which sport you're in. And so if you're going to be relying on carbohydrate as that main fuel source, the important fuel source for a race, if it's going beyond sort of 90 to sort of 2 hours, then you're going to have to start thinking about, I've got to have more than glycogen stores on board. I'm going to have to maximise those, but I'm going to have to keep supplying extra carbohydrate during the race to keep topping it up. And the conventional sports nutrition guidelines have said that's the better approach, that you, if you've got the opportunity to keep topping up carbs, then do all your sort of preparation around that. Which is not to say that you're not burning fat, and it's not to say that the training that you've been doing hasn't taught you to be good at burning fat. It's just that when you get into the race format, you're going to want to try and make carbs be the major fuel source and have enough of them so that you can get across the finish line, and then you can stop. You use your last gram of glycogen as you hit the finish line is the ideal. And the reason for that, and it's only really when I started doing the supernova studies that I started to think about why this is the case, because it's been sort of the sports nutrition guidelines since the 1960s, and it gets challenged from time to time, but it's persisted. And there's two reasons why it's a good idea. And one of them is because the fuel supply that carbohydrate can provide uses less oxygen to produce the same amount of the ATP, which is the chemical that actually provides the energy for exercise. And so even though all our previous sort of focus had been on how much of the fuel have you got, how much fat, how much carbohydrate, when you're working at marathon speeds of sub 2 hour marathon, you're trying to burn it at such a high rate that what becomes the limiting factor is not just the fuel, it's the amount of oxygen that can be provided to the muscle and then the mitochondria to be able to burn it. So the fuel needs oxygen. It can't be burnt, or at least fat can't be burnt without oxygen supply. Carbohydrate's interesting because it has two different pathways. It can be burnt without oxygen, and that's the pathway that produces the lactic acid, but it can be burnt at very high intensities with oxygen, and that's the really efficient fuel source that we want. So when you're dealing with sustained high intensity endurance event, you really do want that most efficient fuel, and it's probably 5 to 8% more efficient, which, you know, mightn't sound very much on paper. That's just a small advantage, but when you're working at those speeds, it's 2 minutes in a marathon. It makes a huge difference to performance in terms of that high end, whether it's world records, Olympic gold medals, or whatever it is. And so that's one of the reasons why carbohydrate's important. It's got the different pathways and it's more efficient in terms of how it produces the ATP. The other thing we now have become more sort of aware of is that carbohydrate has an interaction with the brain about how good you feel. And even just putting carbohydrate in your mouth helps your brain feel more energetic. It feels less tired. It feels like it can go up in another gear or stay at the gear that you're at. And so part of the reason to taking in carbohydrate during an event now is not just to give the muscle more fuel, it's to make the brain feel good. And when you do it regularly, it's a bit like a Homer Simpson brain. You can keep doing the same thing and it just goes, no, and it doesn't get sick of it. So we now look for ways during events, not just to keep the muscles happy, but to keep the brain saying to the muscles, hey, keep going, we're having fun here.
considering the importance of carbohydrate here and how we should be emphasizing our intake, especially when we're in close proximity to competition, what might a pre-race meal look like for some of these Olympic athletes in these events?
Well, they do work from a couple of days out, as you said. So that's when the carbohydrate loading happens. And what it's doing is filling up the muscle stores of glycogen. And as I said, elite athletes or highly trained athletes become very good at storing it. And then they need the dietary intake of carbohydrate to finish off the job. So they're eating very high carbohydrate intakes for a couple of days. And what we also do is to strip away the fibre in the diet. So we use what we call a low residue diet. So all the fibre, all the carbohydrate forms that you might be having, like fruits and rice and pasta and bread and cereal, etc., you would use the white form of it. So, white rice, white bread, pasta, and all the fruit or vegetables that you might have in that time would be either juice or mashed and certainly peeled and cooked. So the fibre has been removed for it. And the reason that we do that is that anyone who's eating a normal healthy diet at any point in time has probably got half a kilo to a kilo of just intestinal contents. And so if we can reduce that in the days leading up to the event, and it's the same thing that people do if they're having some bowel surgery or bowel investigations, you do that kind of a diet and get rid of the contents of your bowel for your procedure. And we do it before the race so that when the athlete gets to the starting line, they're half a kilo to a kilo lighter. Well, they're not actually, because the glycogen they've stored is adding to their weight, but hopefully the low residue diet sort of cancels that out. But also just in the practical sort of thing, no one wants to be caught short on race morning looking for a toilet. So if you can make sure you're not going to have to do a number twos that morning, then it's really practical, both before the race and during the race, just to take one extra sort of stress point out of the equation. So that's what they've done in the days leading up to it. And then race morning is sort of a bit more just topping up. Most of what it's probably storing now is the glycogen in your liver. So overnight when you haven't eaten, that's what your liver's job to do, is to keep maintaining blood glucose supplies. And it usually, is fairly exhausted by the time the morning comes. And so having a carbohydrate-rich meal then helps to just give the liver some glycogen. And it's also a little bit about just sort of comfort and regularity. Sometimes that can be the meal that just helps you to do that number twos, because it's just the last little bit of volume and intestinal stimulus. And it depends on the race as to what athletes sometimes do, because we'd normally say to an athlete, look, 2 or 3 hours before the event is when you should eat that meal, so that you've had plenty of time to digest it and it's more now comfortable for you moving at high paces. But if you've got an event that's starting at 5:30 in the morning, which is what one of the race walking events did, then you're committing that athlete to be getting up at 2:30 or 2 and which is what we did for other reasons in Sapporo. But so sometimes an athlete might make a decision between having a bit more of a sleep in and having a smaller meal versus getting up the good 3 hours beforehand and having a larger meal. And we work with athletes to practice all this in training so that they kind of know what's the correct amount, timing, type of food that's going to work for this event.
You stated earlier that there is this unique difference between competitive race walking and marathon running. That being, in race walking, the sports nutritionist has the opportunity to be more involved throughout the event to help the athlete. With that main difference in mind, were there any unique things about the intra-race nutrition that differed between competitive race walking and competitive marathon running?
Yes, so the Sapporo Marathon ended up being a partly loop course, and so I was on an aid station that was the 20, 30 and 40k aid station, and so I did get to see the runners a bit more frequently than I would in many other marathons. And one of the things I should say is that our marathon runners were really proactive with their nutrition strategies, more so than sometimes the culture of many marathon running teams allow. So it's interesting to me, marathon running tends to be a little bit behind the science and the practice compared to race walking. And that might be just because of culture, or it might be because of the practicality that it's much easier, as you said, with race walking to have contact with your athlete right throughout the event. So our marathon runners actually were much more proactive in not just the fueling aspects, but also with the rehydration aspects and the cooling aspects. And with both teams, we had ice cold towels, we had very cool drinks, and we also used some menthol containing gels during the race. So menthol is an interesting product. It's a bit like what I said about carbohydrate before. It has an interaction with the brain. So when you have menthol, whether it's chewing gum or a mouthwash or a cool mint or whatever it is, your mouth feels cool, and that's not because it actually is cool. If you put a thermometer in there and measure it, your temperature hasn't changed at all, but there's little receptors in your brain that interact with the menthol, and it makes your nasal passages all dilate a little bit, so you get more air coming in, and that air feels really cool. And so in terms of helping someone who's working at high intensities and feeling pretty hot keep pacing themselves well, that menthol we were using to just make them feel a little bit more refreshed, and so that their comfort levels during the race didn't have anything. It would not change their temperature at all, but we were hoping that the pace they were running at was sensible, but also that the ice around the neck or in the hat or in the hands, different techniques that we use, would actually cool the body a little bit, and then the menthol would just amplify the sensation of that, so the athlete would feel good. I'm in control. I'm still on top of this.
I didn't know that tip about the menthol. That's very interesting. Louise, recently John was on the show and we talked all about the science of train low. And I put the question to him if he had any insight from you about utilizing train low with the Australian athletes leading up to the Olympics. I was wondering if you could provide any insight into that now for the audience.
Yeah, so look, I would prefer to call it periodized carbohydrate rather than just train low, because it's not just integrating some sessions into the training program where you're training with low glycogen or overnight fasting, but it's also focusing on some of the sessions in the program where you're actually going to train with very high carbohydrates. So you do a mini carbohydrate load and you practice very aggressive fueling during that session to train your gut to be able to absorb carbohydrate, and then to have a very high quality session because the muscle is really well fueled. So the emphasis should be just on, we're going to take carbs away for some sessions. It should be, we're also going to make it really important in others. And so that idea that you look at each training session and what it's trying to do, and then connect it with the right nutrition strategy to amplify the response, is really important. And so we were continually integrating those kinds of training strategies with nutrition in the lead up to the race. And then as you get closer to the race, you sort of change the focus a little bit, that you don't do as many train low sessions and you do more of the train high sessions as you get closer to race. And the other thing I should mention is that with elite athletes, train low happens quite naturally, because when athletes are doing the really high volumes and intensities that you find in elite training programs, they're already stripping glycogen out of their muscles between training sessions as part of the whole deal. And so when you're adding that nutrition strategy on top, it's tinkering, but it's not actually doing as much as it would do if me as a recreational marathon runner was trying to do it, because I would never be running 180k a week. And so, and when we've done our supernova studies, we're doing these train low strategies at times, when you've got a race walker who does a 40K session in the morning and then does a 10K session at night, that 10K session is always going to be train low, even if you don't mess around with the dietary component so much. You can amplify it, but I think one of the reasons that, the volume of training that athletes do is so high, and that there's so much intensity in some of those sessions in the week, and they're put together in a certain way, it's not an accident. We're explaining it now. We can see, oh, that's clever, because what that's done is just create a low glycogen training session, or having that rest day has just created a high glycogen training session for that next one. So we're now looking at the way that coaches and athletes have learned to do their training and saying, wow, that's clever. That's the reason why you're doing that. You didn't know all the reasons, but we've just found another one that explains why that was such a good idea.
On average, around how long are these specific train low sessions kept in the plan leading up to the Olympics? So something for me that I'm not sure if there's any research on this, but there's a specific adaptation that we're trying to achieve with these train low sessions, right? So basically, in my mind, that kind of alludes that, depending on how long these adaptations stay would kind of determine for, how long we keep these sessions in, right? So if we knew that, you could have this block of training and you have 1 to 2 train low sessions in it for 4 weeks. And then we know that those adaptations you make, say, stay around for like 4 weeks. And that would kind of inform us when we can remove that and just focus on, being as productive as we can with training. So I don't know if you know any specific research that looks at that.
Yeah. That's a great question, and I don't think we have enough research to say, yes, it's 7.3 days out that we stop. And I think one of the interesting things we need to think about is that we come up with ideas all the time, and it might be the menthol, it might be the train low, whatever it is, and we suddenly start thinking, oh, that's the most important thing out, and everything else is unimportant. Instead of thinking, like, a coach is really like an orchestra conductor, that every instrument or every different kind of training or nutrition or recovery strategy, whatever it is, we're all instruments that are contributing to the song. And the goal of the coach is to be the orchestra, to know when this one comes in and that one comes in and never goes away, but it might be slow, softer in the background and what have you. And I think there'll be different songs for different kinds of races and different kinds of athletes, because like sometimes, take Sapporo, for example, the heat was a really big deal. And so it's not just about fuel anymore. It's about making sure that you've got, the thermal regulation and the hydration strategies under control. And because it was in COVID, you could only travel in 5 days before the event, which meant that the travel component was different. And remember, that takes time for people to move and to come somewhere else, so their training's interrupted for that period of time. So there's usually so many other little practical nuances that happen with every race that might mean that you're not just driving it around train low strategy. It might be that the last time you were able to do a really long training session was 10 days out this time because of the practicalities of the COVID and the travel and whatever. Whereas another event, you might be doing something in the week of the event. So I think there's so many different considerations that go into that final performance. Sometimes we do a disservice to the way we think by trying to over focus on one thing, and it's almost becomes binary. It's either on or off, rather than saying it's always in there, but the degree to which it's in there with other factors will change from race to race and athlete to athlete.
Absolutely. Now, I want to transition to ketogenic diets for endurance athletes, a specific area that you've done so much tremendous work in. And it's funny because just in dietetics generally, right, we have to constantly fight against this dogma of, carbs will make you fat. Oh, the most efficient way to lose weight, you got to cut your carbs immediately. And then we go into our niche of sports nutrition. It's like, oh, we don't have to worry about that here. We love carbohydrates and sports nutrition. And then we have all this recent stuff of, well, ketogenic diets are the future for elite endurance sports, right? So now there's this controversy that pops up every now and again, and it seems to be peeking its head, right now, and especially with the recent Olympics, it's a topic of interest. So I think to begin discussing this area, it would be useful for the listeners to get an idea of, just theoretically at least, why would an endurance athlete pursue a ketogenic diet? What are the proposed advantages of this approach?
So the key one that's the marketing exercise is that by being on a carbohydrate restricted diet with high fat content, you have to make your muscles and other organs better at burning fat as a fuel source. And we know that the muscle can do that. It's very plastic, and in even as little as 5 days of that kind of adaptation, you can double the amount of fat that it can burn during exercise. And so it now becomes the major fuel source, even at higher intensities. In general, most of us have what we call a fat max. We have the exercise intensity at which we maximize our fat burning properties at around 45 to 55% of our VO2 max. And when you then switch to this ketogenic diet within 5 or 6 days, not only are you doubling the amount of fat that you can burn per minute, but you're also increasing the maximal contribution to it to about sort of 70 to 75% of VO2 max. So it changes the way that your muscles are fueled. And the idea is, well, then if we can start being more reliant on fat, we don't have to worry about the whole carbohydrate story. So we don't need to carbo load, we don't need to take in extra carbs during exercise. Now, that's the sort of key message that people promote the diet for. But the part that we don't yet really understand, because that first part is actually very well documented, but the second part, the role of having high ketone levels in your bloodstream, we don't know what that does. There's a lot of speculation that that could be useful, that it might have other properties around health and performance, but that to me is the big mystery, because there's really no clear evidence of what those high circulating ketone bodies are doing. And in the studies that we've done, we've really focused on the fat burning side of things, and we've been able to show that that's not helpful for the kind of endurance events that I work with. When I've got athletes running marathons and doing race walking, they're working at higher than 75% of their VO2 max. And so now we're getting into the territory where the economy, the efficiency of using carbohydrate to produce ATP becomes really important. And what you need to do is look at your event and see, well, what does it take to be successful? And so if you're doing events that require you to have those intensities, and it doesn't have to be for the whole race. Tour de France riders are doing 65% of VO2 max for most of the Tour de France. But when they're sprinting to lines and breaking away and going up hills, they're not. And so you've got to think about what's the importance of having that top speed versus the ability to just keep going forever at a moderate speed. And even the 50K race walk was sort of an interesting one for me, because you might have thought that's the crossover, that it's probably on average around 70 to 75% of VO2 max. But the way that it's performed is now quite different, that athletes sort of move at a certain speed for some of the race, and then they have another gear, and they move up to that other gear from 40K on. That's fast. When Jared won the London Olympic Games gold medal, his two fastest splits were his fastest split was from 45 to 50, and his second fastest split was from 40 to 45, and he just moved himself way up in the pack. The world record for the 50K event is by Johan Deniz, a French athlete, and at 48K in that race, from 48 to 49K, he walked a 4-minute kilometre. That's really moving. That's the kind of speed he'd be doing if he was doing a 10K event. So our races, to be competitive and successful, need to be thought of in, what does it take? And very few endurance races are, stochastic, or they're few of them are steady state. Mostly there's important parts where they are at very high intensities, but even the level at which they're starting off before they get to those very high intensities is still high. So in our hands, at least, having carbohydrate as the main fuel supply and an ability to be able to digest it and absorb it and get it to the muscle and then burn it at the muscle is important. And what we've found the ketogenic diet does is, if you just rely on the ketogenic diet by itself, you don't have the capacity to burn carbs, and you don't have enough muscle glycogen to make it a contributing factor. And so it impairs your ability to do that really high intensity endurance event. And even if you said, well, let's take it out over a longer event like the Tour de France, you'd say, well, and even if you said, well, on those days of the Tour de France, that's going to be important, let's carb load the night before and have some carbs on the day. In our hands, we've found that the ketogenic diet adaptation down-regulates your ability to use carbohydrate. It reduces your ability to break down glycogen in your muscle and to put it through that pathway that I said before was the really efficient aerobic use of carbohydrate. And it probably impairs your ability to absorb carbohydrate from the gut, because that's another trained experience. And so it's sort of almost like, if you're going keto, you can commit yourself to that, and it's very difficult to then get carbs to come in and play along with your instruments that day. Taking in carbs during a race with a keto-adapted athlete might still help the brain feel better, but it's not going to really help the muscle to have that extra fuel thing. And it's interesting because the way that keto is often promoted is it improves metabolic flexibility. That's because people are saying, oh, yes, you're better able to use fat. But it doesn't actually improve metabolic flexibility because it reduces your capacity to use carbohydrate. So it's a trade-off that doesn't help with the sustained high-intensity endurance exercise. So where it might have its benefits is when you're doing something at those moderate intensities for a long period of time. And so some of the ultra-endurance athletes use it, although I hear that they also try and incorporate carbs both during training sessions so that they don't lose the ability to absorb it, and they may maintain some of the muscle's ability to burn it. And then they add some carbs during the race itself. Not always, but some athletes who are keto just do keto, and they in fact, I read somewhere that the keto adapted athlete can go for 100 hours without having anything at all apart from water. So, but that's a different kind of performance, and it's not anything that they give out Olympic gold medals for. So, even though I'm more than happy to recognise that there are some events that that it could be a useful strategy for, and some individuals for whom it might work, it's not really relevant in the kinds of sports that I work with.
Excellent. So many fantastic points there, Louise. So just generally, right, it sounds good on paper. We can tap into these unlimited fuel stores for energy, and then, not have to worry about the limitations of, what we can store in terms of glycogen. But as you mentioned there, ultimately, even if the average relative intensity isn't too high, and it would seem as though a ketogenic diet would be fine or even efficient for the specific event, there's still going to be these times where you're going to be turning gears. Maybe you have to climb quickly up a hill, or it's the end of the race, and carbs are going to become important in those situations. And basically, no matter how you slice it, on average, having some carbohydrates is probably going to benefit your endurance performance, regardless of what the specific event is. But there are some, cases where in ultra endurance events, there's some individuals who can thrive on a chronic ketogenic diet. But you mentioned there that one of the central issues is that as you adapt to this high fat, low carbohydrate diet, you lose the ability to basically utilize carbohydrates. And that brings us to this hybrid strategy, right? This idea that, well, what if we can get the best of both worlds, by acutely using a ketogenic diet and then, using carbs around our training or just loading before a competition. And this comes to a study of yours, maybe a couple of studies, that basically investigates how quickly these adaptations can occur in terms of when we lose this ability to utilize glycogen. So I think it would be really beneficial for the listeners to have an overview of that study and just an idea of, how quickly these adaptations can take place.
Yeah, so we don't have a complete time course, but we think that somewhere between 3 and 6 days, the adaptation to burn fat better and as a downstream effect, reduce your capacity to use muscle glycogen. We think that's the amount of time it takes to adapt. And I suppose it would be, logical to think that there's a similar time to de-adapt. And I think with the keto side of things, it's almost difficult to, it is a bit of black and white that if you do be a keto person and then want to bring it in for the race, then by the time you've adapted to be able to use carbs, you're going to have lost a lot of your ability to use fat. When you go in the other direction, so athletes who are more carb focused or periodized carb, as I'd prefer to call it, they do have better ability to burn fat than the average person. In fact, they're actually quite good at burning fat and burning it at high rates. It's just that they maintain the ability to burn carbohydrates. And one of the things that this sort of periodized training might do is it's not just looking at how much fat you're burning as the essence of itself. It's about thinking about how your training is increasing your mitochondria. That's the fuel cell that does all the work aerobically to produce the energy. And so burning fat is one of the hallmarks of having lots of mitochondria, because that's what they're doing. They're burning fat and carbohydrate. And maybe the whole purpose of doing this kind of training is periodized training is not just that you're burning fat, it's more that you're building lots of the mitochondria that can do all the fuel production. And then on race day, you load them up with carbs and eat more carbs during, so that you've got lots of motors and you've got the right fuel going to them. So I think that's probably the better way that I like to think about things, that this periodized training, it's not about just fat burning in itself. It's about why you can fat burn, and the fact that you can burn more fat because you've got those mitochondria ready to go, and then you can convert them into carb burning machines is the real sort of talent that you're trying to learn.
So to me, it kind of sounds like the theoretical benefits that we're after with this periodized nutrition can be obtained with, how these train low strategies are typically programmed, which is usually around like once or twice per week. So I guess my question would be like, do you see there being some sort of theoretical advantage to using anything more severe than that? So in your studies, I think it was like a 5 to 6 day period where the athletes used a ketogenic diet, like, is there a theoretical paradigm or a question that you would like to answer with future research that could possibly be superior to just using, a train low 1 to 2 days per week, like something, I don't know, like a ketogenic diet for 3 days and then back to high carb? Like, is there any sort of like periodization model that you think still needs to be tested to determine whether there might be some sort of advantage to some sort of hybrid strategy, if that makes sense?
Yes, it does. Look, we've tried so many, and with
Yeah.
million permutations and combinations. So I'm not saying that we've done everyone, but what we often do is pick one and then find that the learnings from it mean that it probably knocks out the potential benefits of some of the others because we see something. So, for example, being on a high-fat, low-carb diet knocks out your ability to use glycogen, and it probably takes 3 or 4 days to improve. And I'm not sure why there'd be benefit in repeating that over a period any more than just doing the sort of daily, within a day, carbohydrate restriction through the train lows, because then you've got the ability to keep the train highs going as well. Problem about being on keto is that if you're doing it through the dietary means, it takes a while to commit. And one of the studies we did tried to periodize it, having 3 weeks of it, a bit like altitude training, because we were thinking, well, okay, if it's not going to be useful in its own right, maybe you could, a bit like doing altitude training, have a block of it and do some kind of a adaptation process in your muscle, and then when you got back to carbs, you might have some legacy from that led to better performance, a bit like the altitude training model. But when we did that, we found that there was no advantage. In fact, if anything, there was a bit of a disadvantage because the training that you'd done during that 3 weeks just lost quality, and so it didn't add up to some superior thing. I think if we were still interested in what the ketone bodies are doing, and maybe if we think that they may be having some sort of a separate benefit, not yet demonstrated but talked about, that's maybe where the ketone ester supplements might be useful, because you can take a ketone ester and within hours you've got high ketone bodies. You don't have to wait days for it through the ketogenic diet version. And so if it does turn out that there's some benefits of having high circulating ketone bodies, then maybe the way to study that or achieve it in real life would be through periodic use of the ketone ester supplements. But I also point out that most of us, in some point of the day, we do have high circulating ketone bodies. When you wake up in the morning, because you've had that overnight fast, we've had to produce ketone bodies to cope with the relative lack of carbohydrate or energy. And when you do the train lows, you also increase the ketone level baseline. It doesn't get to very high levels. I mean, it still is usually under 0.5, where some people think this magic zone of ketone body levels would be a sort of at least 1 millimole, probably even over 2. But it's not saying that it's one or the other. Like, it's not saying that the only way to have a ketone level in your blood that you can measure is through a ketogenic diet. So again, there's a bit of this black and white thinking that you're either all in or all out. And I'm thinking that, again, some of the reasons why the athlete practices are what they are, just through experience, is that, yes, the reason that you might do some fasted training or some train low is that it does increase ketone body levels for that period of time. So we're still interested to, dabble in it from time to time, but I think at the moment there's other really interesting questions around periodizing, and we're probably moving a little bit away from just fuel now and looking at what periodizing energy does, because we know in sport that the achievement of the right body physique and also the intensified training programs that athletes do from time to time within their annual year put people in low energy availability. And sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's just a sort of an unintentional consequence of the training. And there is recognition of syndromes like REDS, or female and male athlete triad, where too long a period or too high magnitude of energy restriction causes downstream problems to an athlete, both performance and health. And yet we know that there needs to be some periods of time in the athlete's calendar where they do change their body composition or train hard and find it difficult to eat enough to cope with that. So how do we get those benefits from training without some of the individual and collective problems associated with low energy availability? So we're moving into more of that periodizing at the moment, because we think that's got some interesting things that we could work on to improve health and performance of athletes.
Very interesting. Louise, I know we're coming up on time here, but one last thing for you. So you mentioned the possibilities of ketone ester supplementation. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like last time I looked into this body of evidence, there were a handful of studies and just mostly no performance enhancing effects of ketone ester supplementation, but that doesn't mean that there's a specific context where theoretically they would be useful. So do you have something in mind, or maybe I'm just misremembering?
No, you're absolutely right on. I think the ability to use the ketone supplements to create this fuel advantage, so taking them around an exercise session before or during, I think the story around that's become one of, we've done as much as we can and we really can't find a consistent benefit. It's a very, very complicated metabolic environment when you've got high ketone bodies and carbohydrate at the same time. And so there's a lot of interaction between these different metabolic pathways that impair the use of some. But what's becoming probably the main way that the ketone bodies are being used at the moment, at least in the sports that I'm hearing, is that people are having them after exercise and thinking of them having some sort of a recovery adaptation benefit. Now, that's still not proven, but that's probably the one that might be worth pursuing. And I'm not sure what we're actually even trying to measure, whether it be an effect on glycogen synthesis or protein synthesis or some change in inflammation or whatever it is. But there's probably more focus being targeted to that use of the ketone supplements rather than I take them as a fuel and it's an advantage. The muscle burns very little of the ketone body itself as a fuel, so it doesn't seem to be there that it's providing an advantage if there is one.
Awesome. Okay, Louise, that's all I have for you today. Before we go, where can we point the listeners to for those who want to support you, learn more about your work? Of course, we'll have the study references in the description. Do we have some social media to plug?
Look, I'm on Twitter. I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter. It's been funny in COVID. I follow people now that are very funny. I try not to follow just the trollers and the negative people, but there's a lot of fun people out there, and we also try and use it to promote any good messages about sports nutrition. So find me on Twitter, I guess.
Very good. I will link that up. But everyone, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs. Thank you so much for listening.